to be paid for? Well, the reality is, like many of us have said, we don't have a crystal ball. But what we can do is we can look historically at what's been done, and from that we can determine, or we can project, what we might expect coming up. So what we did is we looked around and we found someone who's been involved in similar projects in other areas, and we found Mr. Craig Canfield. So it's my privilege to introduce him today and invite him to come and talk a little bit about what he's seen in other areas who have faced similar decisions that we're about to look at. So, Craig?
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. Well, I'm glad I went third, I guess I'm glad I went now before John, because I couldn't have spent 10 minutes trying to get through while the computer got fixed. So, appreciate that, John. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try to get some examples of similar planning and environmental work for airport relocation projects that have happened in the Northwest here. And one of the interesting things that we've found out is there has been very few projects. So my name is Craig Canfield. I work for an engineering firm in Billings, Montana, Canfield, Jackson Engineering. We have not been hired to do this work yet. We're interested in it. The city is going through a selection process, and they will hire a consultant to do the environmental and planning work for this project. Right now, a firm hasn't been hired, but our firm has been involved in several planning projects, site selection projects, airport relocation projects, and that's why John asked me to come out and talk to you today. Canfield, Jackson is an engineering firm. We do all sorts of engineering, basically civil engineering, municipal surveying, do airports, transportation, GIS work, things like that. We're a medium-sized firm in the Northwest, and our airport group has about 40 engineers, planners, and technicians in it. So we've done quite a bit of work in at least Montana and the Dakotas. This slide here is kind of a representation of site selection and airport relocations that have happened in Montana and the Dakotas. When we first, I guess, kind of got brought into this project, we were asked, well, you know, in the last 20 years, how many airports have been relocated in this part of the country? And I guess I was a little bit surprised that really none have been relocated in Washington. I mean, Montana, there have been 4. They're represented by the octagon-shaped on the map, the stop sign shapes. There have also, and then the stars represent site selection studies or planning work that have gone into airports thinking about relocating. So as you can see in Montana, I guess there's 4 stop signs and 2 stars. The stop signs have been airports within the last 20 years that have actually been relocated. They had existing conditions at their existing airport. They couldn't overcome some of those conditions, and so the best thing was to relocate those airports. Canfield, Jackson has been involved in the Malta Airport, the Poplar Airport, and the Broadus relocation airports. In North Dakota and South Dakota, you can see there's been quite a few just site selection studies where a study's actually been undertaken to determine whether the airport should be moved or not. We've evaluated different sites, and then a determination's been made in the end whether to relocate or not relocate that airport. As you can see here, there's more stars in North Dakota and South Dakota than there are stop signs. So site selection studies have been done, but what's been determined that the existing airport could accommodate the proposed improvements by the new airport, and the airport remained in place. The Colville project is really going to involve 2 phases. It's going to involve a site selection phase and also an environmental phase. And those are really kind of two phases, but in some degrees they kind of happen concurrently. So what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes is what each one of those phases involves. The site selection phase is there'll be several components. First is project justification. And the right-of-way ladies talked about establishing purpose and need and necessity. And one of the things that this justification phase does is evaluates that and makes a determination whether or not the public needs there and it is indeed necessary to move the airport, relocate the airport, or do nothing with the airport. We determine what the aviation activity will be at the airport. We'll develop aviation forecasts, how many operations will occur from the airport, what kind of aircraft will use the airport on a regular basis, and from that we'll develop design standards, how big the airport should be. So then we know what we need in an airport, and then we go into site selection. And in this case, with site selection, we'll probably look at reasonable airport sites with, say, within a 30-mile radius or a 30-minute driving time of Colville. We'll identify all potential sites, whether we know they're feasible or not feasible, but they really need to be evaluated and put into the mix to see whether they would work or not. We'll use tools that are available to us. That would be GIS modeling. That will help us determine what the terrain looks like. It'll help us determine soil types, property ownership, land uses, and those types of things. And we can take all that information and use that modeling technique to help us come up with the best airport site. Along the way, there'll be lots of public information meetings, opportunities for public input along the way, and we will also be coordinating with the agencies as we move along in the site selection process. Basically, from the site selection process, we take all those sites that are potential sites to build a new airport, and come up with probably 2 or 3 sites that would be studied in detail. For whatever particular reason, those other sites would kind of drop out of the mix, be 2 or 3 sites, maybe more, maybe less, that are obvious sites that need to be studied in detail. Financial planning, that is where we figure out how the improvements would be paid for. And the main source of financial financing the project would be through the FAA. On eligible project items, runways, taxiways, lighting systems, land acquisition, planning, environmental work, the FAA currently funds 95% of those costs. There would be some ineligible costs that the FAA wouldn't participate in. Those might be bringing water and sewer to the airport if that was needed, parking lots, pretty much things that are on the outside of the airport fence would be an ineligible project cost. And the financial planning process would also identify what those costs were and make some recommendations on how they would be paid for as the project moves forward. Financial planning will also phase the project. How much of the airport needs to be built at first? Does the entire 100% runway length need to be built, or could a shorter runway length be built? Those kinds of things. In the site selection phase, we'll also be starting to scope out what the environmental work will be. What kind of studies need to be done? We'll be getting agency concurrence in the studies that will have to be done, and then we can move on to the environmental tasks. Some of these, the site selection and the environmental phase, are done concurrently to some degree. But if we had to break them apart, this would be what the environmental components are going to be. We're going to refine purpose and need once again. We have to be able to justify the project in order to get it funded, to be able to generate community support, and to make sure that the project happens. here's where we find out whether or not we really need the project or not. And that's a very important component with any planning project is the project justifiable? There will be certain environmental studies that have to be completed, wetlands inventories, wildlife studies, hazardous materials on the site has been selected, those kinds of things. How are we going to impact the site environmentally? We'll also take a look at the socioeconomic impacts, noise, those kinds of things. Once those environmental studies and environmental impacts have been determined, then we're able to determine what kind of mitigation would be required to overcome some of those environmental impacts, environmental concerns. The outcome of the environmental process is an environmental document and an environmental finding. For most airports that we've been involved with, there are certain levels of environmental documentation that occur on various projects. Most projects can be completed with a categorical exclusion. What we would anticipate for this project is that the environmental document is going to be what they call an environmental assessment. And then the third environmental document that we haven't seen in these kind of projects is a full-blown environmental impact statement. We would anticipate for this project that the environmental document that would be prepared would be an environmental assessment. Once that document has been prepared and all the steps have been gone through, then it's submitted to the lead agency, and in this case it would be the Federal Aviation Administration, and they would make a determination on how complete the document was and whether the project would proceed or not. If the determination is favorable, a finding of no significant impact or a FONSI would be issued, and then the project can move forward. So when you take those two tasks, the site selection study and the environmental process, and you kind of run them concurrently, basically what we're doing is at the top, we've identified potential airport sites. In the middle, we've evaluated environmental criteria, aeronautical criteria, and community criteria. Funneled those things through, and hopefully we've come up with the best practical site that makes the best sense for the community, and that would be our preferred site. Once we get down to the preferred site, we've gone through the environmental process, the environmental determination has been made by the FAA, then we can move forward with the project. What I'm going to go over now are some examples in Montana that I'm familiar with about airports that have gone through this process, both the site selection process and actually moved the airport to a new site. I've got one airport in there that I'll show you a little bit, the Laurel Airport, which went through a site selection process, but we kept the airport where it's at. But basically the Broadus Airport, the airport was constructed in the 1960s, had insufficient runway length. It was around 3,100 feet. Didn't meet any standards related to the FAA standards. There were concerns with wildlife issues. Runway was too short. Didn't have adequate protection off the ends of the runways. Things like that. Pavement was in poor condition. The FAA asked that before we move forward with trying to improve that airport, that we go through this process and see if other alternatives were available to us rather than trying to improve the Broadus Airport. Broadus Airport is located in southeastern Montana. It's a pretty rural community. It's about 80 miles south of Miles City, 60 miles north of Gillette, Wyoming, so it's pretty rural. Major need there was to get an air ambulance in. when people need to go to the hospital. The runway was right around 3,100 feet, in poor condition, and most of the time, an air ambulance would not come to the Bravos to pick up patients. So